Mrs. Verschuren, if we could have your attention, please.
Yes.
Do you swear that the evidence you shall give on this examination shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I, Annette Verschuren, do solemnly, sincerely, and truly affirm and declare that the evidence I shall give on this examination shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cooper, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Verschuren, the Auditor General's report found that the conflict of interest policy for directors at SDTC did not comply with the SDTC Act. Specifically, it did not comply with respect to Section 12.2 of the Act that states unequivocally that board members shall not profit or gain any income from the foundation. You were the chair of the board. Can you explain how the board adopted and maintained a conflict of interest policy that did not comply with the SDTC Act?
Mr. Chair, I believe that all office holders owe Canadians a commitment to accountability, and I've been accountable. I resigned as the board chair.
Ms. Verschuren, with the greatest respect, that was not my question. My question is, how is it that the SDTC board had a conflict of interest policy in place that didn't comply with the Act? And here's what this unlawful so-called conflict of interest policy allowed board members to do. And this is right from paragraph 6.46 of the Auditor General's report. Board members were allowed under the policy to buy or sell securities in companies who were funding recipients of SDTC as soon as 3 days after a public announcement of a funding decision. So how was that allowed to stand?
Mr. Chair, those were the procedures. Those are the procedures at the time. And I...
Mr. Sharon, here's the situation we have. The SDTC board could approve funding for a company on Monday, and then on Thursday, board members could buy or sell shares in that very same company. Do you know what that is? It's insider trading, isn't it?
Mr. Chair, those processes were in place when I arrived as chair. And so this was the recommendation
they remained in place for 5 years. You were the chair, and for 5 years they remained in place, and you did nothing about it, did you? And Leah Lawrence, the CEO at the time, went to you and said the conflict of interest guidelines or policy as it pertains to the board need to be strengthened, and you kiboshed efforts to strengthen those conflict of interest policies, to bring them in line with the Act and to end the insider trading. Isn't that right?
I followed what I believed and recommended by independent legal advice.
Is that the independent legal advice of the conflicted Ed Vandenberg? Is that the legal advice that you received? Is that your excuse?
And from the management team, that was the way in which
it's very interesting because at SDTC there was a conflict of interest policy for staff. Staff, quite appropriately, were prohibited from investing in a company funded by SDTC for 5 years following a project's completion. 5 years. And yet board members could invest in companies 3 days after a public announcement of a funding decision was made. How do you explain that?
Mr. Chair, the procedures were those that I followed. And
those were ones that facilitated insider trading. And you know what the explanation is? That the board that you chaired was corrupt from top to bottom. And by the way, Ms. Verschuren, you've sat as a director on publicly traded companies, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
And you know full well that pursuant to the rules on insider trading and self-dealing from the Ontario Securities Commission, that directors can't purchase shares in the company in which they sit as a director on within days of a public announcement. You know that you can't do that, right?
Mr. Chair, I believe that I
asked you, you know that that's not the case. You can't do that.
Mr. Cooper, your time is up. I'm going to allow the witness to answer. So, Ms. Verschuren, you have the floor.
Certainly the procedures were established when I got there and continued. And I think
big green gravy train.
I'm going to move on now.
Through information received from the head of the appointment process at the PCO, Donalyn McClymont, we received certain information with respect to the process, the recruitment process, the actual hiring. So it would appear that applications were received by the PCO on the 12th of October, 2018. 56 applicants had applied. The PCO interviewed 8 to March the 15th of 2019. Of those 8, 5 were recommended to be reviewed by Minister Bains at that time. However, none of those 5 passed whatever sort of threshold test Minister Bains had applied, because during that interim period, from October of 2018 to May 2nd, 2019, another 47 applicants had applied. It was shortlisted to 16. 3 were ultimately interviewed. You were part of that process. In fact, you had applied after your conversation or conversations with Minister Bains on April 30th, 2019. So a total of 6 recommendations were sent to Minister Bains. So now with that timeline in place, as to the best of your recollection, when do you recall first receiving that phone call from Minister Bains? And if it wasn't from Minister Bains, was it from someone from his office? Explain that process to us, please.
Mr. Chair, I don't recall the date of when I received that phone call. I don't recall the date of that.
Applied on April the 30th, 2019. Was it the day before? Was it a week before? Was it a month before? Does that help you recollect? Your application was filed April 30th, 2019.
Yeah, I don't recall.
Okay.
But
And was this just a cold call out of the blue? You picked up the phone rang, and hi there, Ms. Verschuren, this is Minister Bains. I have something to present to you. Was it something like that, or was there a process? Was there an email? Was there a letter that set up a specific time that he wanted to reach out to you? What can you recall about the process?
the process wasn't, it was probably, it was in the context of advice I was giving to him as part of industry, his industry portfolio. And I think he did talk to me once outside of a telephone call. And I do not recall what he said at that time.
Well, it must have been flattering to you that he would consider you for this very important position. You clearly indicated you wanted some time to think about it. was there more than one phone call from Minister Bains, again, highly recommending to you that you apply for this position? Was it more than once? Because I got the impression when you initially testified at a different committee that it was possibly up to 3 different phone calls, maybe 2 to 3 different phone calls, and that you ultimately made the decision to apply. Does that refresh your memory?
I think that there could have been a couple of occasions that he brought this up outside of a telephone call. I was involved with some events that he was at, and so, it was a general conversation.
I'm running out of time. I want to ask one last question.
Briefly.
Did you declare your conflict with respect to the SDTC during any of those conversations with Minister Bains before you filed your application, yes or no?
Mr. Chair, I don't recall talking specifically about that conflict, no.
Thank you very much.
In the timeline on your appointment, when you sought advice from the Ethics Commissioner on your conflict of interest in assuming this position, the conflict of interest being that the board that you were about to chair of the organization that was already lending or granting money to your company, was that after you had accepted the position in your conversations with Minister Bains?
I believe it was done absolutely before I was appointed, and it was done. It was done in the I think it was a few days before.
You applied. Somewhere in that neighborhood you applied,
yeah.
But after okay. I'd like to follow up on the questions. So you sat on the board of the Verschuren Center, and did you sit on the board of Sandpiper as well?
No, I did not.
Okay, but you are an investor in Sandpiper, and you sit on the board of the Verschuren Center, did at the time?
That's correct.
At the time you were chairing the SDTC board. Correct?
I'm trying to remember when I became an investor in Sandpiper, but.
Okay, I'll come back to that. So the Verschuren Center sought $6.8 million from SDTC, and they did that without consulting the board of the Verschuren Center? Because when I look at the cash flow statements and the income statement of the Verschuren Center from the time, it appears that it was in desperate need of this money.
I declared conflicts at the board of the Verschuren Center on anything to do with SDTC.
That wasn't my question, though. It did go through the board. So when it went to the board investment committee on January 13th, the minutes, January 13th, 2022, the minutes rejected it, as you say, for all the reasons of conflict of interest. And the minutes say that SDTC would shift its efforts in discussion with other potential funding sources and hope that the diligence conducted to date can be transformed into another funding agency. And that was in January. And in June, ACOA gave the Verschuren Center $2 million. And so on. For the next couple of months, another $4.2 million was given by other government agencies, another $1 million in September by ACOA, another $3.1 million by ISED, which Mr. Noseworthy acted for, and also another $1.4 million from DFO in May of that year. So do you believe it was ethical to use the staff of SDTC to be the business development funding officers for the Verschuren Center that you sat on the board of, on both, that you used the staff of your own agency that you chaired to help fund government money in other ways for the other organization you established and sat on the board of?
Mr. Chair, the Verschuren Center is a non-for-profit organization, the, any funding goes to support the ecosystem and its company.
That wasn't my question. You chaired an organization that used its staff to find other government money when it was conflicted and you couldn't get money out of the thing that you chaired, the Green Slush Fund. So you used the staff to find money from other government departments who then ended up giving the Verschuren Centre not $6.8 million, but $11 million. To me, that's a total abuse of your position, just for MP from Erskine Smith's information. He doesn't seem to think that's a problem. And then that centre,
Point
the
of order,
Verschuren
Mr.
Centre,
Chair.
the Verschuren Centre then invested.
Point of order, Mr.
Just
Chair.
1 second, Mr. Perkins. Yes, Ms. Khalid.
Absolutely uncalled for, taking
Miss
shots
Khalid,
at
that's not a
colleagues.
point of order, and
No,
that's
it is a
by the standards of this
genuine-
committee.
Point of
That's a
order.
pretty light poke.
Point of order.
So,
Point of order.
yes, Mr. Smith, your poke at a Conservative member was quite a lot harder than that, but I'll hear your point of order. Go ahead, please.
Well, it's actually not, Chair, because he's suggesting that I don't care about an ethics violation when I've clearly
Yeah, okay,
stated
look,
multiple times that I do.
the meeting's been going
No, it's my
exceptionally well.
reputation
No,
and-
Ms. Perkins,
well-
this is not a point of order. And there is a Liberal member up next, and if you feel the need to rebut what Mr. Perkins, anyone else is saying, you're free to do that, but these are not points of order. These are light pokes I'm hearing from all sides, and they're certainly well within.
I understand,
Yeah.
Chair, but I'm on record saying I don't approve of ethics violations, and Mr. Cooper's on
Okay,
record saying he
thank
doesn't
you.
understand insider trading.
Yes, you made your position clear in your turn, and if you like another turn, you're welcome to speak to your whip. But these are points of debate, not points of order. Mr. Perkins, you've got about 30 seconds left.
So as a board of SDTC, you used the staff to find funding for the Verschuren Centre, which you couldn't get from SDTC. You got twice as much from the government as you asked for. And then that centre invested in an organization that you have a financial interest in, Sandpiper, Denova, and the Bio Creators. So there is a clear link between your efforts to get money for the failed Verschuren Centre, get that so that they could give money to a company you had a financial interest in. That's a direct conflict of interest, and it's personal benefit by you, which is what the minister set up when he appointed you and knew and was warned that you had conflicts of interest.
Mr. Verschuren, I assume you have no.
No comment.
That's fine. That's fine. Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 5.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Verschuren, going back to the appointment process, when you finally made the decision to make application after you spoke a number of times with former Liberal Minister Bains, did you actually reach out to him personally to confirm you had made the decision and you would be applying?
I'm not, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure whether I confirmed with him or one of his colleagues.
Okay, but at least when you say colleagues, you mean a member of his office, correct?
Yeah, yes,
Okay,
correct.
so there was a confirmation to his office before you made a formal application, correct?
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Unlike other worthy candidates, your appointment as chair of SDTC was definitely initiated through the PMO. Who in the Prime Minister's office did you speak with prior to your interview with the PCO?
Mr. Chair, I do not recall talking to anybody in the PMO's office. or
Ever?
PCO's office.
Ever during the process?
I do not recall, no.
Okay. Do you recall the actual interview with the PCO?
I do.
Who interviewed
recall-
you?
I don't recall, but I can get back to you.
Okay. Prior to your resignation as chair in December of '23, did anyone from the PCO, the PMO, or the current minister's office or any other department official advise you against resigning?
Mr. Chair, no one advised me against resigning.
Okay. When I had the privilege of meeting with you at one of the other committee meetings for the first time, I recall how strongly against you were in terms of any sort of pushback from members to impugn your character, to impugn your integrity, and you were very defiant that there'd be absolutely no grounds by which you would resign. Ultimately, you did make that decision to resign. The allegations that you claimed were out there were simply allegations. Now they've been proven by the Ethics Commissioner. You have been found guilty by the Ethics Commissioner on 2 occasions. So why did you resign?
Mr. Chair, there was a lot of stress in the organization, a lot of stress with respect to, what was happening there at the time. And I was putting perhaps undue pressure on that.
Okay.
The CEO.
Thank you. Thank you. Since your resignation, have you had any discussions with the Prime Minister's office, the Privy Council office, or Industry Canada about which documents related to your tenure at SDTC would be withheld from Parliament?
I've not had any conversations on that matter.
Okay. Have you had any input from current board members at SDTC about your tenure and which documents would either not be released or fully redacted or partially redacted from the view of parliamentarians?
Mr. Chair, had no conversation with anybody about withholding any documents.
You clearly are keeping abreast of what's happening here in Parliament. Parliament has been literally shut down because of the government's refusal to hand over unredacted documents, all unredacted documents pursuant to the order of the Speaker of the House. Do you believe, and the evidence clearly has shown, that the government has chosen to supply us with thousands and thousands of pages of full redactions? Do you, as a former chair of the SDTC, believe that the redactions are an effort to shield the former and current minister from being held accountable?
Mr. Chair, that's something that I cannot comment on.
Because you don't have an answer or you don't feel comfortable?
Mr. Chair, I disclosed all my documentation to SDTC, to the Ethics Commissioner, to the Auditor General.
Okay.
And
And why, and these were unredacted documents that you supplied?
correct?
Mr. Brock, I'm afraid that is the time. I know your side will have one more
Thank you, Chair.
opportunity. Mr. Cooper, you're up for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, despite Mr. Erskine Smith's profound ignorance of the rules of the Ontario Securities Commission, Ms. Verschuren, as someone who served as a director on publicly traded companies, you will be aware that under the rules relating to insider trading and self-dealing, directors cannot buy and sell shares in the company days after a public announcement. Rather, they can only do so during limited windows outside of the quarterly financial reporting periods. And yet, the conflict of interest rules for the SDTC board, which violated the Act, allowed board members to buy and sell securities within 3 days of a funding announcement. I ask you again, why didn't you fix the policy? Because it sure sounds like a good deal for board members.
Mr. Chair, again, I followed the procedures that were established at the time that I joined that board. Reviewing these things were the responsibility of management and
So you take no responsibility. Now, I'll ask you this. What constituted a public announcement? Was it just a press release posted on the SDTC website? Is that a public announcement?
Mr. Chair, I don't recall.
Yeah. Well, if Mr. Erskine-Smith wants to dispute whether it's technically insider trading or akin to insider trading, it certainly is a racket, it certainly is corruption, and it certainly is a very different standard than the 5 years that staff members at SDTC had to wait before they could do what you permitted yourself to do as a member of the SDTC board. But speaking of law breaking during the time that you were the chair of the SDTC board, your fellow board member, Andre-Lise Methot, admitted when she appeared before this committee, Ms. Methot being a very close friend of the Minister of the Environment, Stephen Guilbeault, that the board funneled $10.4 million from SDTC to companies that she had interests in through her investment firm, Cycle Capital. How did you allow that to happen?
Again, Mr. Chair, this was part of the decision-making process in terms of the COVID payments, and
No, Ms. Verschuren, $10.4 million went into companies that Ms. Methot had an interest in, and these were not COVID-related payments. Ms. Methot left the room, in fact, when the monies went out the door, but 12(2) of the Act states very clearly, no director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property from the foundation or its activities. The Act wasn't complied with, just as the conflict of interest policy that you had in place didn't comply with that section of the Act. So again, I put it to you, how did you allow $10.4 million unlawfully to be funneled into Andre-Lise Methot's companies?
Mr. Chair, the process was the presentations were made to the Project Review Committee. The Project Review Committee would recommend putting them forward. This was a process that I believe was the same as before I was the chair. So I think it was.
Well, Ms. Verschuren, 12.2 of the Act is pretty clear. I just read it to you. What part of that did you not understand?
Go ahead, Mr. Cooper, ask again.
I asked,
I'll give you time, ask again.
I said section 12(2) of the Act is clear. I read it to you. What part of it did you not understand when $10.4 million was funneled into Andre-Lise Methot's companies while you were the chair and sat on the board?
As chair,
You have bothered to have acquainted yourself with a very fundamental component of the Act.
Mr. Chair, I certainly recognize, as chair, I felt that I was following all the policies and procedures and conflicts of interest associated with STTC's.
Well, policies and procedures. Ed Vandenberg, who was providing you counsel, was also being remunerated while he served as a member of the SDTC Council. And while you were the chair, he was voting to appoint 5 members to the board that you were the chair of an improperly constituted council. Did you ask any questions about that?
Mr. Vandenberg provided legal advice and provided service to the SDTC board and to management. And
he was making unlawful appointments to the board while you were the chair. And you just didn't care? You just turned a blind eye to that too? You know, it's conflicts of interest, it's unlawful appointments, it's self-dealing,
Mr. Cooper,
akin to insider trading.
that is your time, Mr. Cooper.
On and on it goes.
Mr. Cooper, that is your time.